Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are heading to the very tip of Italy,
Right.
to a region that you might know as the toe of the boot,
Yeah.
Calabria.
Wonderful spot.
It's an area that's just absolutely overflowing with ancient history
That's right.
and a really captivating winemaking story.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it kind of gets overshadowed, on the world stage by some of those bigger names in Italian wine. But trust me,
Oh, yeah.
this is a story you do not want to miss.
It's a good one.
So I'm really excited to be diving into Calabria today
Me too.
with you. And
Well, you know what's so intriguing to me about Calabria
yeah,
is that it might not be as famous as some of the other Italian wine regions globally,
right.
but its winemaking heritage goes back like way, way back to
Oh, yeah.
ancient times.
Thousands of years.
It's incredible. You can
Yeah.
almost feel the presence of those early civilizations when
Yeah.
you're walking through the vineyards there today.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that makes this deep dive so exciting.
Right.
We've got some really incredible material here
Yeah,
to work with
for sure.
that offers like a true sommelier's perspective on Calabrian wine. So if you're anything like me
Yeah.
and you are drawn to like those kind of unique wine regions
Yeah.
with these compelling narratives behind them, or maybe you're just on the hunt for your next like big discovery in a glass,
Right.
I think you're going to love this episode.
I think so too, because it's not just about, what the wine tastes like.
Right.
It's really about the history and the land and the passion of the people
The people behind it.
that make these wines so special.
Absolutely.
And our source material really dives deep
Yeah.
into all of that.
Yeah.
So we're talking about everything from the early days of grape growing in Calabria,
Right.
like how it all began with the influence of ancient cultures, the crucial role of terroir, that unique combination of climate, soil, all the natural factors. Yeah.
The amazing diversity of native grapes that you find there, how the wines are made using both, centuries-old traditions and modern techniques, what they taste like,
Right.
the best foods to pair with them, and even, current trends and what the future holds for Calabrian wines in the market. It's a really complete picture.
It's amazing. And so our goal today is to kind of go through all this, unearth like the most interesting parts, the most insightful pieces from all this information, and give you a really well-rounded understanding
For sure.
of Calabrian wine.
And hopefully inspire you to
Yeah.
seek out some of these wines and
Give them a try.
experience them for yourself.
Absolutely. So why don't we start
All right.
at the very beginning
Yeah.
with the history of winemaking
Okay.
in this region.
The history is ancient,
Yeah,
like way back.
it is.
Our sources emphasize the huge impact of the Greeks,
Okay.
starting as early as the 8th century BC.
During a period known as Magna Graecia. And they didn't just bring grapevines with them.
Right.
They brought like pretty advanced winemaking techniques for the time. And, to them, wine wasn't just a drink.
Wow.
It was a huge part of their culture and their economy.
I mean, it's so interesting to think about that, right?
Yeah.
Like, so long ago,
Mm-hmm.
wine was such a fundamental element
Yeah,
of their lives.
it really was. And the Romans, when they continued that tradition.
Okay.
Calabrian winemaking really flourished under Roman rule, and their wines were highly valued throughout the Roman Empire.
So they were shipping them all over.
Oh, yeah, they were trading them, exporting them all over the place,
Wow.
which shows, how good these wines must have been even back then.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's like a stamp of approval right there.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So we have this like very vibrant ancient period
Right.
when it comes to Calabrian wine. What about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance? Did Calabria maintain that like top spot in the wine world?
So from what our sources tell us, winemaking did continue.
Okay.
During those times, often, supported by monasteries and large estates. But compared to some other Italian wine regions that really boomed during the Renaissance,
Right.
Calabria's role was a little less prominent.
Okay.
It wasn't really at the forefront of wine innovation or commerce
Got it.
during that period.
Okay. So kind of a less prominent era in its wine history.
Yeah, you could say that.
But it doesn't end there, though.
Oh, no.
Right.
This story definitely doesn't end there.
There's been like a recent resurgence.
Exactly. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen a really exciting revival
Okay.
in Calabrian winemaking.
Okay.
And this is driven by a new generation of winemakers who are like so passionate about quality and about showing off the amazing native grape varieties that Calabria has to offer.
Okay, so that leads us perfectly into our next topic.
Oh, right.
Which is this idea of terroir.
Yeah.
So crucial.
Super important.
When it comes to wine, but for anyone listening who might be new to wine, can we just take a second to break down what terroir actually is?
Of course. So terroir, in the simplest terms, it's basically like the unique set of environmental factors that make a wine taste the way it does. Our sources describe it as like this interplay of things like climate, soil, the lay of the land, or the topography, and even like the cultural practices of the people making the wine. It's all of that combined that makes a wine so specifically tied to where it comes from.
So unique to that place.
Exactly. And Calabria being right there at the tip of Italy, definitely has a very distinct origin.
Right.
And climate. So how does its climate, play into the terroir? So Calabria has a classic Mediterranean climate with hot, dry summers and mild, rainy winters.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is that it's influenced by two seas.
Okay.
The Tyrrhenian Sea and the Ionian Sea. And the source material really emphasizes how these two bodies of water actually impact the temperature variations along the coast.
Okay.
And how the grapes ripen differently on the eastern and western sides of the region.
Oh, wow.
And then you also have to consider the impact of altitude in the mountainous areas inland, which creates even more like microclimates.
Oh, wow. So you've got kind of like this warm, sunny coastal breeze on one side, and then maybe like a cooler, more moderating influence coming from the mountains.
It's a really dynamic environment for those grapes to grow in.
Wow. And so you've got the maritime influence, you've got the higher, cooler areas inland. That must lead to a lot of diversity.
Absolutely.
In the wines.
For sure.
What about the soil?
Yeah.
Our source material mentions a bunch of different types of soil found in Calabria.
Yeah. There's a really impressive variety of soil types in Calabria.
Okay.
You've got clay, limestone, granite, even volcanic soils.
Wow.
And they each bring something different to the wines. Right. So clay soils, for instance, they tend to give wines more body, more richness. Limestone brings minerality and like this brighter acidity. And granite soils often produce wines with a lot of elegance and finesse.
Wow. Okay, so it's not just like one type of soil.
No, not at all.
That's dominating the whole region.
It's like a patchwork of different soil types. And that's one of the key things to understand about Calabrian wines. It's this diversity. It's what makes them so complex.
It's amazing how something that's like happening underground can have such a profound effect on what we're tasting.
Sure.
In the glass. And, of course, all of this ties back to those indigenous grape varieties, which you mentioned before. The Gaglioppo, the Greco Bianco.
Yeah, these native grapes, they've evolved over centuries to thrive in Calabria's very specific condition. They're totally intertwined with the terroir, and they're essential to expressing that unique character of the region.
Okay, and then finally, under the terroir umbrella, we have topography. The lay of the land. How do the mountains and hills of Calabria shape the wines?
So topography is really crucial because it affects things like how much sun exposure the vines get, drainage and air circulation.
Okay.
So those mountains, hills, and coastal plains create all these different pockets with their own unique microclimates.
Right.
And that just adds another layer of diversity to the wines.
Yeah, like a mosaic almost.
It is. It's really fascinating.
Okay, so we've got this like really intricate and fascinating terroir happening.
For sure.
Now let's talk about those indigenous grapes in more detail.
All right.
So you mentioned Gaglioppo and Greco Bianco.
Yeah.
Let's start with Gaglioppo. What can you tell me about this flagship red variety?
Gaglioppo is like the king of Calabrian red grapes. It's the one you'll hear about the most, and it's the basis of the famous Syrah DOC. And the sources say it actually has ancient Greek origins.
Which takes us back to the beginning.
Full circle, right back to that ancient history we were talking about.
I mean, that's so cool.
It's amazing how those ancient Greeks, their legacy is still alive in the wines that are being made today.
Absolutely. So what about the sensory profile of Gaglioppo? What kind of like aromas and flavors do you expect?
Well, you'll typically get like red and black fruit aromas and flavors, often with some spice notes and kind of an earthy undertone. But what's really cool about Gaglioppo is that it can age beautifully.
Okay.
And it develops more complex characteristics over time.
So it's not just like a simple one-dimensional red wine.
No, not at all.
It got some depth to it.
It's got layers.
Yeah.
It can be young and fruity or complex and age-worthy.
Wow. Okay. I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
All right, now let's talk about Greco Bianco.
Okay.
The main white grape of Calabria.
Yes. Greco Bianco.
What's its story?
So this is the star of the white wine scene in Calabria.
Okay.
And it's the primary grape in the Greco di Bianco DOC, which also includes a Passito version.
Okay, so that's a sweet wine.
Yes, a sweet wine made from dried grapes.
Okay, awesome.
And like Gaglioppo, it's believed to have Greek origins.
Really? So another connection.
Yeah, another link to that ancient history.
That's so cool.
It's pretty fascinating.
And when you taste a Greco Bianco, what should you be looking for?
You'll typically find like bright aromas of white fruits, citrus notes like lemon and grapefruit, and pretty floral hints, often like white flowers.
Okay.
The sources also talk about some herbaceous and mineral undertones, which add to the complexity and the freshness of the wine.
Okay, so a nice, like, bright, aromatic white wine.
Absolutely.
What about Mantonico?
Yes, Mantonico.
This one's maybe a little less widely known.
Yeah, it's not as famous.
Yeah.
But it's another important white grape in Calabria. And it tends to produce wines that are more complex and structured compared to Greco Bianco.
So what does that mean in terms of, like, aroma and flavor?
Well, you might get some stone fruit aromas and flavors.
Okay.
Like peach and apricot, maybe a little bit of honey, and even some dried fruit notes.
Okay.
And our sources point out that there are often some delicate floral and spice nuances as well.
Oh, wow.
Which suggests that Mantonico wines have good potential for aging.
Interesting. Okay, so maybe a white wine with a little more body and richness compared to the Greco Bianco.
Exactly.
All right, now it doesn't stop there.
Oh, no. There are even more grape varieties to discover.
So tell me about some of the other players in this Calabrian wine landscape.
Yeah, the source material mentions a few other autochthonous varieties.
Okay, can you quickly remind us what autochthonous means in this context?
Yeah, sure. So autochthonous basically means that these are grapes that originated and evolved specifically in Calabria over a long period. So they're like native to the region.
Exactly. They're uniquely suited to this area.
Okay.
So we've already talked about Gaglioppo and Greco Bianco, but we also have Magliocco Canino, which is a red grape that adds a lot of color and tannin to blends.
Okay.
Then there's Nerello Cappuccio, another red grape with more fruity and floral characteristics.
Okay.
And finally, we have Pecorello,
All right.
a white grape with good aromatic potential and nice acidity.
Wow, it's amazing how many different grape varieties are thriving in this one region.
It's pretty impressive.
So much potential for unique wines.
Yeah, it's a really diverse wine landscape.
All right, so let's talk about how these grapes are actually cultivated and turned into wine.
Go.
In Calabria, what are some of the viticulture practices?
So the source material highlights two main ways that vines are trained in Calabria.
Okay.
You have the traditional Albarello system, which is also known as bush vines. And in this system, each vine stands on its own. And then there's the more modern Espaldera system. Okay.
Which is also called trellising, where the vines are trained along wires. And, which system a grower chooses often depends on things like where the vineyard is located and the style of wine they want to make.
Right.
Makes sense.
Okay. And in terms of managing the vineyards throughout the growing season,
yeah,
are there any really important techniques?
Well, the usual things apply, like pruning the vines to control their growth and managing the yield so you don't get too many grapes.
Right.
But Calabrian producers also have to be really smart
Yeah.
about adapting their techniques to the local climate.
Which we talked about.
Exactly. It can be pretty demanding with that heat and the potential for drought.
Exactly.
But they've learned to deal with these challenges.
So how do they do that?
Well, they often use rootstocks
Okay.
that are more drought resistant, and they use efficient irrigation methods where they need to. And there's also a growing focus on sustainability and organic farming.
Oh, that's great.
Which is really encouraging.
That's really good to hear.
Yeah, definitely a positive trend.
So we've talked about the grapes, we've talked about how they're grown. Let's talk about the winemaking itself.
Okay.
Starting with the red wines, what are some of the key techniques that are typically used in Calabria?
Okay, so for red wines, one of the most important steps is maceration. And that's where the grape skins are left in contact with the juice
Right.
for a certain period of time.
Yeah.
And this allows the color, tannins, and flavors to be extracted from the skins.
Mm-hmm.
Winemakers have to decide on the duration and temperature of this maceration.
Okay.
And whether to do a cold soak before fermentation, and then during fermentation itself.
Right.
They need to choose the type of yeast they want to use and control the temperature carefully. And then another important process for many red wines is malolactic fermentation, which basically softens the acidity and makes the wine taste smoother.
Right.
And finally, a lot of red wines are aged in oak barrels.
And this can have a big impact on the final style and complexity of the wine.
Right. And what about white winemaking?
Okay, so for white wines,
Yeah.
they often use a gentle pressing method to get the juice out without too much harshness from the skins.
Yeah.
Fermentation usually happens in stainless steel tanks at controlled temperatures. This helps preserve the fruit aromas and keeps the wine fresh.
Right.
They don't usually use new oak barrels for white wines because that would overpower the delicate fruit character.
Makes sense.
And sometimes they'll use a technique called Lees contact.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Where the wine sits on the dead yeast cells after fermentation.
Right.
And that can add complexity and texture.
Cool. And then we can't forget about rosé and sweet wines.
Right.
What can you tell me about those?
So our sources mention that both rosé and sweet wines are made in Calabria, but they don't go into a ton of detail about the specific methods.
For rosé, the pink color comes from limiting the contact time between the juice and the red grape skins.
Right.
And the Greco di Bianco DOC is particularly known for its pasito, which is that sweet wine made from dried Greco Bianco grapes.
Right.
And drying the grapes concentrates the sugars and flavors.
Yeah.
So you get a rich and aromatic dessert wine with those like honey and apricot notes.
Oh, wow. Okay, so a lot of interesting stuff happening in the vineyards and in the wineries.
Yeah, it's a cool mix of tradition and modern techniques.
All right, so now let's get to what I know a lot of people are really excited about.
Yeah.
The tasting experience.
Right.
What should we expect when we crack open a bottle of Calabrian wine?
Let's do it.
Let's start with the reds.
Okay, so with Calabrian reds, you'll often get this beautiful range of aromas.
Okay.
The younger wines will have more of those fresh and vibrant red and black fruit notes. And as they age, they develop more complex aromas like dried fruit and leather. And there's often a characteristic spiciness and earthiness to them as well.
Yeah.
It's really interesting how they evolve.
And what about on the palate? What kind of flavors and textures should we expect?
So the flavors often mirror the aromas, with the fruit being the main player.
Right.
And you'll usually get those warm spice notes as well.
Okay.
And then the tannins, those can range from quite firm and grippy in the younger wines to softer and more integrated as they age.
Okay.
And then the acidity gives the wine freshness, and the overall body can vary too.
Okay, cool. And what about the white wines?
Right. So Calabrian whites are typically known for being bright and refreshing, with aromas of citrus fruits like lemon and grapefruit, white fruits like pear and apple, and those pretty floral notes that we talked about earlier. And sometimes you'll get these little hints of herbs and minerals, which add to the complexity.
Okay.
And on the palate, they tend to have that same vibrancy and freshness with good acidity. And you might notice a distinct mineral quality in some of them as well.
Interesting. So it sounds like there's like a real contrast between the reds, which are often more robust, and the whites, which are typically brighter and more aromatic.
Exactly.
And our sources mentioned that there's actually a range of different wine styles within Calabria.
So you have your younger, fresher wines meant to be enjoyed young.
Right.
And then you have your more complex, structured wines that can age for years.
Yeah.
And of course, you've got rosés, which can be light and fruity or more full-bodied. And those delicious, sweet pasito wines.
So lots to explore.
Oh, yeah. Definitely something for everyone.
All right. So for anyone at home who's like, okay, I need to try some of these wines.
Yeah.
Do we have any tasting tips?
We do.
To help them really appreciate these Calabrian bottles?
So first of all, serving temperature is key.
Okay.
Those lighter-bodied reds actually benefit from being slightly chilled. And whites and roses should always be served well chilled.
Okay.
And then using the right glass can make a big difference too.
Right.
Because it concentrates the aromas.
Makes sense.
So when you're tasting, take a moment to really smell the wine before you take a sip. And then pay attention to how it feels in your mouth.
Right.
Notice the tannins, the acidity, the body,
Yeah.
and how the flavors change from the first taste to the finish.
Yeah.
And then, of course, don't forget about food pairing.
Oh, yeah.
The right food can really elevate the whole experience.
And speaking of food pairing,
Yes.
let's talk about Calabrian cuisine.
Right.
This is like a culinary adventure.
It really is. The food in Calabria is incredible.
I've heard amazing things about it.
And our sources have some fantastic examples of traditional Calabrian dishes, and they're perfect wine pairings.
Okay, lay it on me.
Okay, so we'll start with a classic Lagane e Sici, which is a pasta with chickpeas. And for that, you'd want a young, vibrant Syrah Rosso. The wine's freshness and lighter tannins won't overpower the dish.
That sounds delicious.
It's a classic pairing.
What about something a little richer?
Okay, so for a richer dish like fileja with ragu di cinghiali, which is a pasta with wild boar ragu, you'd want a more structured Ciro Rosso Classico Superiore. Something that can stand up to that rich, meaty flavor.
All right, for those like hot summer days, what's a good rosé pairing?
Oh, you gotta try spaghetti alla manduja.
With that spicy sausage.
Yes, exactly. And a Ciro Rosato would be perfect for that. It's got the acidity to cut through the heat and the fruitiness to balance the spice.
Oh, man, that sounds so good.
It's a flavor explosion.
All right, are there any other like local specialties that really shine with Calabrian wine?
So many good ones.
Yeah.
So there's salsiccia calabrese, which is another amazing Calabrian sausage. And that pairs really well with a young, fruity Syrah Rosso. Or a lighter Lamizia Rosso. And then for a really hearty dish like Capretto al Forno, which is roasted goat, you'd want an aged Syrah Rosso Classico Superiore. So the tannins have softened and those complex savory flavors have developed.
That sounds incredible.
Yeah.
Okay, what about seafood?
Ah, yes. Calabria has such a beautiful coastline.
Yeah.
Seafood is a huge part of the cuisine. So for a dish like pesce spada alla ghiata, which is swordfish in a rich tomato sauce with olives and capers, you'd want a crisp and aromatic Siro Bianco. That acidity and those citrus notes will really complement the richness of the fish.
Sounds refreshing and delicious. And what about some of the more like vegetable-focused dishes?
Yeah, there are tons of those in Calabria. So melanzane alla calabrese, that's like their version of eggplant, would pair really well with a refreshing Siro Rosato or a lighter Lamezia Rosso, depending on how the eggplant is prepared. And then we have to talk about the cheese.
Oh, yeah.
Pecorino Crotonese.
It's a sheep's milk cheese from the region. And you can have that with a younger Syrah Rosso if it's a fresh cheese, or an aged Syrah Rosso if it's a more mature Pecorino.
Oh, wow. Okay, so many good options.
I know, it's hard to choose.
It is. All right, so we've talked about all these specific pairings, really showcasing, you know, the local ingredients and traditions. But can we think a little broader?
Yeah.
How might Calabrian wines pair with cuisines beyond just Italian food?
So the sources suggest that those fresher Calabrian whites and rosés, with their bright acidity and those aromatic profiles, can actually work really well with a lot of Asian dishes.
Oh, interesting.
And then those more structured Calabrian reds can definitely hold their own with grilled meats and richer dishes from all kinds of culinary traditions around the world.
So they're not just limited to Italian food.
No, they're very versatile.
That's great. Are there any like overarching principles
that we should keep in mind when we're trying to create our own pairings?
So the most important things are balance and harmony. You want to match the weight and complexity of the wine to the intensity of the food. Think about balancing the acidity in the wine with the richness of the dish. And look for flavors that complement each other. It's all about finding that perfect match.
Awesome. All right, so as we start to wrap up our deep dive into Calabrian wines, let's talk about where these wines stand in the market today and what the future might hold.
So the sources really emphasize how important those DOC and IGT designations are for protecting and promoting Calabrian wines. And just to remind everyone, DOC stands for Denominazione di Origine Controllata. And it's a quality assurance label that's used in Italy to make sure that wines from specific regions meet certain standards.
So it guarantees the origin of the wine and it sets rules for how it's made. Okay, so that's what DOC means. And then IGT stands for Indicazione Geografica Tipica.
That's right.
Okay, and that's another Italian wine classification.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little broader than DOC.